So yeah, my name's Peter Chittum. I lead the developer evangelism team in EMEA and also in North America. So for instance, the quiz you just played was built by one of the evangelists who works for me. That's Philippe Ozil. He'll built that. We also work on sample apps that are things like the LWC recipes app, e-bikes, Dreamhouse, and those ones. Those are all part of the work that we do. And as part of that, I got to play around with and participate in the pilot and beta for Lightning Message Service and build some features around it that we've incorporated into the sample apps. So when I signed up to do this global gathering, I offered to bring some of that content um, to this presentation. And it's actually, I've been kind of evolving it. I gave this presentation for the North England developer group about a month ago. And since then, I've had the opportunity to evolve a little bit and to add some stuff on scoped messaging, which is one of the GA features that came out with Lightning Message Service in summer 20. So time to move on to our forward-looking statement. All I'm going to say about this is that please don't make any purchasing decisions based on any features that I talk about that are not currently generally available. This is my first presentation of Lightning Message Service where it has actually now been released. So this was a very important slide previously when I've given this talk, but now, as of summer 20, Lightning Message Service is generally available. How exciting is that? It's good stuff. Really, I just want to give the briefest of introductions to Lightning Message Service in slides, and then go through and do some demo and walk through some code and that sort of thing, and also show you where you can find that code in case you want to give this a try. When engineering set out to create Lightning Message Service, there were some principles that they had in mind. The first one was to have a client-side event bus that would allow messaging between DOM branches. So on the client side in your browser, where Salesforce has a relatively complex DOM structure when you log in. How can we make it so that those bits of the DOM can message each other directly? We also wanted to make sure that Lightning Web Components, Aura, and Visualforce were all treated as equal citizens. And the third thing was for it to not be surprising. And I'll talk about that a little bit in the kind of second part of my presentation, where I'll talk about scope. So what do we mean by communication between DOM branches? So this is just a little diagram that I created to try and illustrate the problem that the Lightning Message Service solves. And you can see here, a fairly simplified version of two distinct DOM element branches underneath the document object. And of course, if I do a dispatch event call on any one of these elements in either of these two DOM branches, that's fine. Something above it can add an event listener and then respond to that. But if, say this element over here needs to listen to a message that's fired by this element over here, in a relatively simple part of the DOM, there's things that you can do to bubble an event up to sort of a higher level. But again, in a very complex DOM architecture, this can be difficult. Just FYI, there's somebody that hasn't muted themselves, and I can hear the rustling of your papers. So please have a look at your mute button. Make sure you've muted yourself so that we're not hearing all of that. Okay, so back to the presentation here. So this is the main core problem that LMS is trying to solve, is this complex architecture. And to illustrate that a little bit better, this is a demo that I built to just illustrate something called scoped messaging. But it actually illustrates really well the problem here. I have a publisher that's in a popped out window. I have a subscriber that's sitting over here on the utility bar. I have another subscriber that's in the active tab, and I might have subscribers in inactive tabs that do or don't need to listen to this message. trying to make sure all of those different things are listening to a message, that's a complex problem to solve in the user interface. And so, of course, this is what Salesforce likes to do, is to come up with solutions so that you have a simple API to deal with the complex problem that you need to solve. So hopefully that illustrates the cross-DOM problem. The other problem comes down to Lightning Web Components, Aura, and Visualforce. These are three very distinct technologies that can now live equally in the user interface. So, especially where we have legacy customers who've invested in Visualforce, and maybe then they invested in Lightning in Aura components, and now they want to move on to Lightning Web Components. We need to make sure that all that previous investment can be brought forward as best as possible. So making sure that communication between these different technologies is transparent and easy was also a problem. And this is particularly true of the Visualforce problem. Aura and LWC use a locker service as a means of having security and hardening the security of those components. On the other hand, Visualforce uses iframes, which at the time, that was the valid way to sandbox an embedded page and make sure that the rest, the page that it's embedded in couldn't maliciously access the DOM of that embedded page, or vice versa. So Visualforce has always used an iframe to embed itself in the host DOM that it was placed in. We needed to solve a problem so that a message could be passed from the hosting DOM that is Lightning Experience to the hosted DOM that's inside that iframe. Now, there is a standard web API to do this called post-message, but it is not a trivial implementation detail if you need to do this. And we wanted to make this straightforward so that adopting Lightning Experience wouldn't be hindered by, do we have the time and energy to implement the post message to this one Visualforce page, let alone, maybe there are 20 Visualforce pages. Implementing a solution that would work across all of those could be even more complex. So we wanted to make sure that if you had the investment in Visualforce, you could bring that forward if it was the right thing to do. So all right, so that kind of solves the first two problems, or I think talks in depth about those first two problems. I guess it's probably worth mentioning that a big reason why Lightning Message Service came about was to solve the problem that Aura events previously solved. And we'll come back to that also when we talk about scope. But in the meantime, let's jump out of this and just view a little example here. Now, this is the LWC recipes sample app. And just really quickly, just to show where to find this, if you go to trailhead.com/sample gallery, you can see all of the sample apps that we maintain as the developer relations team. And these are all meant to be applications that you can download and learn from and view the code and the configuration and understand how to solve problems that you need to solve in your day-to-day work as a Salesforce developer. And actually, even as a Salesforce admin, this automation components one is primarily focused around different flow, reusable flow components. So you should check out that one. And I think most of them have a little bit of admin associated with them that's helpful. Now, LWC Recipes is an application that really just focuses on short code examples that show granular features with the fewest lines of code possible. That's kind of the best way to put it. And so that's what this is. When you first start up a Scratch org with one of these apps in it, oftentimes you have to kind of go find the actual app, which is right here, LWC Recipes, and I'll select that. And you can see in the Recipes app that we have a whole bunch of tabs that correspond to different features of Lightning Web Components specifically. This is, after all, the LWC recipes app. And if I go here, for example, to data service, I can see straightforward, simple implementations of using the data service. I can also have this little, that'll take me to view the data service on a contact page. I can see examples of that, examples of calling Apex. And what we've done is incorporated the message service recipes into this over here on this tab. Now, the nice thing about this is that each of these recipes is actually linked back to the underlying Git repo that hosts this. So, I can go and find that Git repo right here by clicking View on Git. However, likewise, if I just want to see this one recipe, so for example, I want to know how do you solve publishing an event with an Aura component, I can click on View Source, and that will also take me to the recipe. However, it will take me to the actual folder for that LWC recipe itself. So that gives you a little idea of how to navigate and use these sample apps. Now, the cool thing about the message service one is that we have an implementation that is using LWC here. So this is an LWC publisher. We have a subscriber. We have Aura publisher and subscriber. We also have a Visualforce publisher and 2 subscribers. The 2 subscribers are so that we could show both Visualforce remoting, which is one way of invoking a call back to the Salesforce servers and getting data, and the Visualforce postback action feature, which is a different way. It's kind of the classic original Visualforce server-side compiled page method of accessing Apex. So, and the cool thing about this remoting one is I'm using remote object, which actually doesn't use any Apex at all. It's a lot more like Lightning Data Service. It's kind of a precursor to that, but in the Visualforce world. So you kind of get, a couple of flavors of those subscribers. And of course, if I click on any of these, it publishes the message. It's the same message that's being published by all of them. It's also the same message that's being consumed or subscribed to by all the subscribers. So, any one of the clicks on any one of these components is going to update all of the subscribers. So let's go do a little walkthrough of the code, because that's really all the demo on the UI side. The interesting bit is about, how do we solve this in the code? And you can see here, in the notes for each of these, we're referencing a little bit of information. So when you go into the code, you can kind of understand what you're looking for. And the message that we are both publishing and subscribing in here is this record selected message. So let's go take a look at the code. Oh, that's right. I'm going to swipe, and that should take me. Let's make sure. Yes, this is LWC recipes. Good. Now, one thing I forgot to open, and I'll just go do that quickly, is the message itself. So what does a Lightning message service message actually look like? Let me go find that static resources. There we go. So we create something called a message channel. Now, message channel is defined in metadata. Incidentally, there is actually an API for creating a message channel programmatically. Currently, that API isn't published, but we're, eventually, this is one of those forward-looking statements. Eventually, the idea would be for a message service to be able to be used in an off-platform Lightning Web Component open source application as well. So look for some more stuff about that in the future. In our case, we define it in metadata, and the advantage of defining it in metadata is that the message channel name itself becomes something that can be used for referential integrity when we save, any component or Visualforce page back to the Salesforce server. So record selected, the __C is implied, kind of like with custom objects. And, I'll show you where I go and reference that in some of my components in a moment here. Okay. Now, is exposed. is just making this available outside of its namespace, and actually is required if we're going to use this in something called application scope messaging. We have a little description here, a master label. The label is required, but doesn't actually get used programmatically. And then we have a field definition. Now, the interesting thing is when we actually create the payload is just a generic, plain old JavaScript object and is completely mutable, just like any other generic, plain old JavaScript object. So even though we've defined this field here, there is no reference check on that. And you'll kind of see why when you see the code that defines this as well. It would be very difficult to do a proper reference check on it. Okay, so that's what a message looks like. Let's go and let's go and take a look at how we've published this and consumed it in each technology. So first LWC, then Aura, then Visualforce. So this is my LWC component markup. There's nothing actually related to Lightning Message Service here. However, remember if we were selecting a contact, it was firing the event, and that's done in this handle contact selected function that we're going to find in the component JavaScript. So we can see here, there is my handle contact selected function. And all that I'm doing is calling this publish API. So let's back up and see where all the different parts and pieces from message service come into the publisher. The first thing is we're importing the message service itself. And in this case, we just import a couple of its APIs. The first one is publish. So that's the actual publish API we use there. The second one is called message context. Now, message context is actually the handle that the message service does. It's kind of it's the handle back to the message bus, basically. Now, we don't use it as developers on our end for anything except to just pass it into the publish. And the way we get the message context is using a wire service adapter. So we'll pass the message context adapter into the wire service, and we'll get the actual handle to the message context with that. We pass that into publish. Now, the second thing that we import is actually the message channel itself. And you can see that here on line 6. So there's my record selected. And this is the thing that actually gets reference checked when we go and save this Lightning Web Component. If I were to misspell this and then try and save the web component, if that doesn't exist in metadata, Salesforce is going to complain on save. It should also give me, so if I was actually working on the code here and I misspelled it, for example, eventually the language server should come around and find that something's wrong about this. We'll see if it comes around and does that in a second here. Okay, so I have my message channel, I have my publish API, I have the message context that gets me the handle back to the message bus. And then the last thing I need is a payload. So I'm just getting a payload from that event that is bubbled up. And then, I'm getting an ID rather from that event that's bubbled up. I pass that into a record ID, and that's the payload. If you recall, in my message channel, I identify there being a record ID. And as I said, this is just a loose association. If I wanted to, I could create other sort of ad hoc properties of this JavaScript object literal, and those would be passed just as well. I wouldn't recommend that. I think as a best practice, and probably people will start to create linting rules around this, that if it's not in the message channel, let's not actually use that as part of the payload. But that's probably going to be something that we're going to have to build as part of developer tooling. That's not going to be built into the platform, and you can see why. It would be really hard for the LWC parser to go and infer that this is the thing in the message channel, if you get my meaning. So that'd be hard to tackle in that static code analysis. So All right, so that's a publisher, and I'll speed up a little bit here now that I've walked through a few of these APIs. Now, what does a subscriber look like? And you can see that this is just a Lightning card that's pulling in some details from a record. And so how do we populate that record? Of course, it's in the JavaScript. The two bits that are associated with message service are, again, from message service itself, again, the message context, and in this case, a subscribe API. And again, we have the message channel. So what we're going to need to do is on the lifecycle hook for connected callback, we're going to call this subscribe function, which then in turn calls the subscribe API and passes out this subscription onto this subscription property of our Lightning Web Component. Now, it doesn't have to actually be publicly exposed, so we're not, exposing this as an @API property. However, it does need to be there because what we're going to see here is we pass again the message context that came in from the wire adapter. We pass the message channel, and then we also pass the handler, which is handle message. And all we're doing is assigning the record ID that was passed to the local record ID property of this component, which happens to also be tied to this get record wire adapter, which then populates the data from Lightning Data Service, and we can see the contact record. Now, the interesting thing is that the message context, when we use it with the wire adapter here, automatically tears down any subscriptions that are in place. So there is, in fact, an unsubscribe API, but I don't actually need to call it if I'm using message context with the wire adapter. That's all will be handled. If the component goes into its destruction lifecycle, the message service will also unregister this particular subscription automatically, which is kind of nice. It's just less code that I have to write. I think that's everything that I need to cover here that is related to message service. Yeah, that looks good. So moving on to Aura. And I think, what I like about how they did this implementation is that the implementation in Aura and Visualforce really kind of feels like I'm writing Aura and Visualforce. So they've tried to follow the idiom of each of those. So in my Aura publisher, I simply have this one tag, Lightning Message Channel. I pass in the message channel, and then it has an Aura ID. Now, again, I have a handler called handle contact select. And what I'm going to need to do is publish a message from that handler. So let's go take a look at that. And in handle contact select, you can see that we go and get this contact ID and pass it to record ID, and that becomes our payload. So it's almost exactly identical to how we did this in the Lightning Web Components example. And then we do component.find, which is the standard Aura API to go and get something out of the Aura DOM, I guess, if you want to call it that, out of the Aura markup. And then we can just call publish directly off of that handle that we get to the message channel. And that's it. So actually, the Aura API is very, very simple. The thing that you're going to notice is when we get to the subscriber, which is next, is there is no subscribe API in Aura. In fact, the subscription is automatically implied, and all of the lifecycle of that subscription is handled automatically, both the subscription and the unsubscription. So here again, we have our message channel. We go here, and then when we say on message, that's going to imply that we're subscribing this handler to a LMS message. And then the handler, of course, we have our record ID, and we have the actual the Lightning Message service itself. So here we get the parameter from the message. We then assign that to contact ID. And then actually here, let me take that back. This is actually just to reload, not the message service, but the Lightning data service rather. So, so really all that's happening is that, that's Lightning message service oriented is this bit of markup. Everything else is just kind of standard Aura stuff, even here in the handler. We get a parameter, we assign the parameter to a property, and then we re-invoke Lightning Data Service. So that's the Aura subscription and publisher. Now Visualforce, if you kind of have joined the Salesforce world pre-Visualforce, some of this stuff is going to look a little bit arcane. But it's helpful to remember that Visualforce is all 100% server-side compiled. So, unlike Lightning Web Components, unlike Aura components, all of this markup here, that stuff is all compiled into HTML before anything ever leaves the server. Actually, that one isn't even. But like Apex page, for example, that's going to trigger it. And we'll see some other examples of standard Visualforce markup a little bit later. Now, importantly, though, we're using this remote object, so that's how we go and get our data. The other thing is that, if I need JavaScript, and I pretty much always will with Lightning Message Service, I need a static resource. In order to make these code samples more digestible and more easy to follow, I kind of followed the same pattern that Aura and Lightning Web Components do, where each Visualforce page, like this is my LMS Publisher Visualforce page, has its own static resource. So this is the LMS Publisher Visualforce static resource JavaScript file. And that just made it a lot more straightforward so that somebody who is coming after and trying to understand, how do I get a publisher to work? Or how do I get a subscriber to work with a remote object? It's going to be very straightforward because, the page will match the static resource JavaScript in name. Now, all of my static resource JavaScript files are using the ES6 module API. And part of the reason for doing this is because there are some JavaScript templates that I wanted to share between some of these different files. So I've actually externalized those into this templates.js that you can see here. And using modules just made this a lot more straightforward. And then it also kind of shows how you can use the module API inside of Visualforce, provided your users' browsers support ES6, of course. So a little bit of the backstory there. Back to the Visualforce page. There is my, my import of the JavaScript file. And I did this as an import call as opposed to a static script import because I also needed to be able to invoke this little API and pass some data, some information into the module. One is, of course, the message channel, because the message channel is accessed via a global variable called message channel. And then I also needed to pass the publish API. So this is the LMS publish API. And sforce.one is an object that sits in Visualforce. And the LMS team just decided to use that as an existing kind of feature of Visualforce that they could also hang the LMS features off of. Now, the last thing I'm passing is the contact S-object model that, this is how I'm getting data without actually invoking any Apex. I was trying to minimize the amount of Apex. And honestly, I really like the remote object features. They're really cool, actually, in a old-timey Visualforce kind of way, if you get my meaning. All right, so I'm passing in the message channel, and the publish API is going to be referenced via LMS publish. Those are the two things I want to look for. So I'm going into my JavaScript. So handle contact selected is actually the handler that's going to fire my publish. And so you can see down here, there's that LMS publish that I passed in. I'm also setting the payload very similarly to how I set the payload. And anything else in there? No, that's pretty much it. Yeah. Now this one here is just about getting the data and kind of standing up the page. So this is really the only LMS-based stuff here. The next is like, how do the subscribers work with this? So here, this is my subscriber with the Visualforce postback. And what you'll see here is there's a lot more Visualforce in this. So there's an output panel. Let's see. I guess that's really the only thing I ended up using. There was a version of this that actually made use of a fair amount of like page block stuff, and then I decided for output panel. In any case, down a little bit, how do I actually update the contact record? Well, I'm actually doing that using a classic Apex standard, custom controller. And that controller has a method called refresh contact. And then this action function basically takes that Apex method and it creates a wrapper around it in the Visualforce context as a JavaScript function. So I'm able to now invoke this Apex function from JavaScript using this name here. And then re-render says, what part of the UI do I want to refresh? And this all seems probably really arcane because this is kind of how we used to build user interfaces. But essentially, this ID here is what we're referencing in this re-render. And so the Visualforce DOM will automatically refresh when this function is called. Let's go take a look at the JavaScript behind this. You'll see it's super simple. Again, I'm passing in my message channel. I'm passing in the subscribe, because I do need to subscribe to this. I'm also passing in this named function here that I created with this Apex action function. All right. So again, we have a subscription. We call subscribe. We pass in the channel and the handler. And just like that, when there's a message on that channel, that handler will be called. Now, remember the handler, come back here. Is going to be this refresh contacts function. And let me just show you where that comes in, okay? Let's see. There we go. So how am I actually setting the subscription? In the Visualforce page, we have to use standard DOM events. So I'm using the ready state change with event.target.readyStateComplete to actually call the subscription. So here is I'm going to invoke this subscribe to message channel. I'll pass my message channel that I passed in from Visualforce, and then I'll pass in this handle LMS message post back. And then this is actually where I'm invoking this action function. So there's a little bit of abstraction going on. And partly I did that so that somebody could take this and kind of run with it to kind of have sort of a reusable Visualforce subscriber. But that's kind of how it all ties together. And eventually I get my channel, my handler, and I'm off and running. The interesting thing is on my action function, all I'm doing is invoking action function and passing the record ID. Let me also quickly jump to that Apex class. That should just take a moment. There we go. So this is my refresh contact method that I'm calling. Methods that are invoked from a page action need to either return void or a page reference. And that passing of the ID actually puts it into the query string. So I'm using apex.currentPage.getParameters.getID. That's going to get my ID value. I'm calling this, I'm then invoking this SOCL query with that contact ID. And that's it. So that contact record is now going to be accessible from my Visualforce page because I've basically surfaced it here as a property. And going back and peeking at the Visualforce, here we go. So each place where I'm referencing an S-object field, I'm also referencing that contact record Apex property. All right. So that's kind of how that's wired together with message service. Last but not least, we have our example with remote object. Again, remote object just surfaces this simple API for invoking getting data from Salesforce, basically using JavaScript. Again, I am going to import my static resource and then invoke my set page configs, which passes in the message channel, the remote object API, and the subscribe method. And then again, go there. So I add event listener. I'm going to call subscribe to message channel. I'll pass in the message channel and I'll pass in the handler. And there we go. Pretty straightforward stuff. And again, in this case, actually, let me go back here. Essentially, when I get that data, what I'm doing is going and getting an HTML template, and I'm just setting that into a particular part of the DOM. So just to sort of show you the difference between that partial page refresh that happens in the other Visualforce and this one. In this one, I'm completely responsible for deciding what's in my DOM. In the other one, Visualforce kind of does it for me a little bit magically, I have to say. All right. So that wraps up the different bits and parts of this example. Let's go and take a look at, yeah. So let's talk about context and scope. So in your UI, LMS created a construct called context, and context is kind of like, high level parts of the DOM. Sort of importantly, things that represent context are normally things like tabs, but they could also be related to a pop-out window. They could also be related to a utility bar. And they could also be related to things like ES6 module imports on a Lightning Web Component. So what your context is kind of depends on what the thing is that owns that. But generally speaking, we refer to context as this near root level DOM feature that contains lots of stuff in it. Also, oftentimes, it corresponds to a flexi page or what we call a lightning page. Now, context works with scope, and scope is defined when a subscriber is invoked or invokes the subscribe API. And that subscriber, if subscribe is called with, by default, with no explicit scope identified, it's going to be in active scope. And what that means is it's going to be sitting in one of these things here. And actually, let me rephrase that. So when I invoke subscribe as active, all of these items here are essentially always active. However, things like tabs that are not currently selected are not active. So it is possible to fire an event and have, for example, a console application tab listen and respond to an event, but it has to be subscribed as application scoped. So let's go take a look at what that actually means specifically. Oop. Actually, let's start with the UI. So this is a demo I built specifically just to show how scope works in different contexts. And let me just do a little walkthrough of what we have here. This is a plain old console application. Just has a couple of things added to it. So I have accounts, contacts, chatter, and home. And let me actually go back to here. Okay. And so I've got a couple of tabs active. I've got, this account. I've got this other account. I've also I have some sub tabs, right? So this is kind of the standard sub tab when I open an account, and there are other sub tabs, but I also have a contact sub tab. And what you'll see is that all of my account tabs and sub tabs, because I've added it to the account page, have an application scoped subscriber. You can see there. However, my contact tabs have an active scoped subscriber. I've also included a subscriber down here in the utility bar that is active scoped. And this is also where my publisher is. So my publisher is actually sitting down here in the utility bar. And you can start to see like the complexity of what you might need to be trying to weave together in eventing across the Salesforce user interface. So what I'm going to do is take my active subscriber, I'm going to pop it out so that it's sitting in its own separate browser window. Okay? And I'll just pop that into the background. And I'll open my publisher and say, here is my first message. And I'll publish that. And you can see here that, my subscriber here has picked that up. Also, the application scope subscribers that were deselected and sitting in the background have also picked that up. And this is because there's a caching that's done for these different DOM elements in the Salesforce user interface. And most interestingly, my active scope subscriber that was sitting in the separate window.
Can you try some other ones as well?
Just so you know, somebody has unmuted themselves, Martina, I believe. If you've there we go. Thank you. In my active scoped pop-out window, I also received that message. So it just illustrates that point that popped out or minimized or popped up utility bar components sitting in the background, they are they are always active even when they are active subscribed. Now, the interesting thing to check out here is that, so this is on a sub tab, right? And again, we have an active scoped subscription over there. So I'm going to go off of that sub tab and do, this is my second message. What happens on active subscriptions? And I'll publish that message. And of course, my application scope worked. I can actually go to this one as well. And that one worked because it's application scoped, right? It was deselected, but it's application scoped. Now this one, however, is still showing the output from that first published message because it is active scoped and it was in an inactive tab. And this kind of illustrates the importance of the message context object, because that message context on the subscriber is what's telling these active scoped components to either go to sleep or wake up, depending on whether or not the tab that they sit on is actually selected at that moment in time. So there's a lot of, there's a lot of inner workings going on with this. The other thing it's important to realize is that, I might have a tab here, but if I've never visited it, it's actually not going to be visible to the message service as well. So it's just something to be aware of when you're implementing this. All right. So that wraps up. Oh, actually, I should probably just really quickly show, like, what does it take to actually do an active subscription? Well, this is pretty much it. So again, on connected callback, if I've set application scope, and I'm doing this at the flexi page level, so when I go and pop my component on the page, I can identify whether it's going to be active or application scoped. So the only difference between the subscription is whether or not I pass this JavaScript literal object with scope set to application scope. And incidentally, application scope is also an import from the message service module. All right. So I realize I think I've blown my time out of the water. Hopefully you guys have all found this really useful. And I know we have some Q&A, so we'll come back for that in a little bit. And there we go. Back to you, Nishant.
Thanks, Peter. It was really amazing. Go back in time, see that remote actions on the JavaScript function.
Yeah,
really nice.
It is kind of a little blast from the past. I totally agree.
Yeah. Coming back, let's continue the talk which we had with Peter. We can do some developer Q&As, and also maybe we can talk about anything you found on the investing, on the LMS side, those things. Now it's the time to unmute everyone and talk to Peter.
Yeah, actually, I will go ahead and start with a question that was asked in the chat. This was from Prashant. Prashant asked if you can create LMS without enabling DevHub, like from VS Code, IntelliJ, or Dev Console. So you do not need a DevHub or a Scratch org. I just happen to work in them because that's kind of our tool chain that we use for sample apps. And it's really convenient. But if you are using org-based development, provided you are using a tool that supports Lightning Web Components, then you can use LMS with Lightning Web Components. If you are using Developer Console and using Visualforce and Aura, you should also be able to use it, although I confess I've not tried it. I can't see any reason why you wouldn't be able to incorporate Lightning Message Service in a Visualforce page or an Aura component in Developer Console.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So my question is like how to create a message channel, Lightning message channel. So can we create without enabling DevHub?
Yeah, that's what I just answered is, there's no DevHub requirement or Scratch org requirement for these.
Great. Peter, just a query from my end. So like we have the publish subscribe model to communicate between the LWC and Aura. I understand like there we cannot do with the Visualforce and those things, but LMS takes over that, right? Is there something different from that? Like how does it, when to use pub/sub model and do those application level communication, and when to go for LMS? Like,
so if what you have is working today, I would, my general advice is to just use that, right? Now, pub/sub was never a supported feature of the platform. pub/sub was an open source API, basically, open source component library that was relatively simple, that was always meant to be kind of a shim that would hold over developers who were ready to adopt Lightning Web Components immediately until we got something to replace Aura events. LMS replaces Aura events. So LMS is a completely platform supported feature. It will be maintained, it will be updated. We will always have good code samples for it. In fact, we have actually removed all of the PubSub examples from the sample apps as of today, because it's not a supported feature. It was just meant to be a holdover. So if it was me, in a project, and I had implemented PubSub, what I would probably look at doing is scoping a way to clean up that technical debt at some point in the future. It should still work. It's perfectly functional. It's a fairly simple implementation of the API, of a PubSub API. So like there's not a lot of it's not a big black box that can't understand. So but to me, it's sort of a fix as technical debt in the future problem if you already have something in production. If you don't, the LMS API is super simple and you get a lot of benefits from using it. So, if it hasn't gone into production yet, I would go ahead and implement it. And in addition to that, we actually have testing examples in the LWC recipes app. Last week we did a blitz, and we tried to close up as many untested lines of um, Lightning Web Components code as we possibly could using jest tests. So if you go into the LWC recipes app, you will not only find a good example, you will find a tested example that you can then also make sure that you're writing tests for your implementation with.
Great. So we have one question from Barry. He's from Dublin Developers Group. So he says, can we subscribe to LMS from external system?
Can you so I guess explain what you mean by external system. Do you have something in mind, Barry?
Hey, Pete. Sorry, I was on mute.
That's
So
okay.
a bit like subscribing to, change out a capture, something like that, or a
I see.
platform event. Can we do the same thing with Lightning Message Service, or can they be linked?
So I could imagine a case where you might be using the EMP API, and in that EMP API handler, you might want to publish a message to other parts of the DOM. I think that's a perfectly viable architecture to follow. I've not done it, but it'd be interesting to kind of build up an example that was a bit more complex, where you had something change on the Salesforce side that pushed a change out to the client, and then the client went and did the updates. The only thing I would say is you want to be careful of what you did with that, because I do know that Lightning Data Service has, it has. I don't know if this is GA yet, but they've been working on a way of managing the data cache and automatically aging out the cache if data has changed, somewhere else in the application. So I wouldn't want to do it for just like some change data, in case you're basically rebuilding a solution that they want to do with Lightning Data Service anyway. But I could certainly see there might be certain events that might happen on the server side that with EMP API you could then fire off a publish event from Lightning Message Service. Is that kind of what you were looking for?
Yeah, that's kind of it. Yeah, going out is the main idea. Yeah, it's cool. Cheers.
Yep.
Okay.
So
Questions?
so Prashant, as far as actually creating the message channel, you do need to do that in that is only done in metadata at this point in XML. So I don't. Let me follow up and see if there's a way to do it in Developer Console. I maybe misunderstood your question early. So Himanshu said, I think you'll be able to communicate from external systems to Salesforce using Salesforce Evergreen. Salesforce function always lets. So I would say that I would strongly recommend conflating anything to do with Lightning Message Service with Salesforce functions. Salesforce functions are a 100% server side feature. Obviously, hopefully there will be a way that if a function comes up with a result, you might want to be able to push that to the client. And then if it arrives at the client, then Lightning Message Service might be able to propagate that to, or would be able to propagate that to different parts of the client. But be really careful about conflating anything to do with Salesforce functions and Lightning Message Service. There's nothing implicitly connected in those two features in any way whatsoever.
Right. Great.
Cool. Any other questions? Yeah, sure. So what's the difference between a message channel and platform events? Platform events are server side, and they surface an API that you can use to invoke them from a client. They also use a publish subscribe model to push events to a client. So really, platform events are around, the best way to think about them is a server-side event bus. The message service is a DOM-based client-side event bus. So message service is purely based on intercommunication of complex components in a complex client DOM architecture. Does that make things more clear? Hopefully.
Yeah. And it's really great to see like these are two buses, communication buses, and to see them both connected together, that would be really something future.
Yeah, it'd be an interesting example to work on. Like we are always looking for examples. If anybody has any idea of how we could incorporate an example into any of the existing sample apps, feel free to contact me. I had my email up there. It's pchittum@salesforce.com, or on Twitter, I'm at pchittum, and my direct messages are open. So if you have an idea for how they could fit into a sample app, shoot me a message or go to the sample apps and write up an issue as an idea. We take, or build it and show us. But probably file the issue first so we can discuss it with you, and maybe we have something in mind already. But yeah.
Okay, one more question. I think we can take last maybe this one. Puneet. I'm building a page which allows users to edit parent record and list of multiple child records. Should I use LMS or just build parent component iterate over child?
Sorry, could you repeat that? It kind of went in and out a little bit.
He's building a page which allows users to edit parent record and list of multiple child records. Should I use LMS or just build a parent component and iterate the child components?
At face value, that sounds like you wouldn't need LMS. The only reason you might is if you wanted to have the list be one component on a Flexi page or a Lightning page, and the detail be a different component on the Flexi page. Like that might be, and you wanted to, or you wanted the page to be configurable so that you could plug other things into that page for your users. Like I could see that as a reason potentially to use a message channel. But if it's just, I need to see a detail up top and a list down below, I think you could just build that component without message service and just use standard DOM messaging or DOM events instead.
Great. So I'll try to maybe close this now. We can, if you have further questions, feel free to reach out to Peter directly on Twitter or send him message, email. It's great. So the last part is you can go on Trailhead and do the trailblazing together quest. So there is a quest on Trailhead supporting the Trailblazer Community Gatherings, Global Gatherings for TrailheaDX. So do that quest and you will win a community badge on Trailhead for Trailhead Quest and also a $50 voucher for a charitable gift. And part of that, there's a step to tweet about your global gathering where you did that global gathering. So you can tweet about us today. So you did this trailblazing together with LKSF devs. So show some love on Twitter, and that's all. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining today. It was great seeing you all today on the TrailheaDX Global Gathering. Thank you, Peter, for joining today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Nishant.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Nishant.
Guys, appreciate it.